"Don't speak unless spoken to," Daniel Whitmore said, his voice smooth as aged bourbon, barely lifting his eyes from the contract in front of him. And just like that, the air inside the private dining room shifted as if someone had quietly closed a door on dignity. Crystal glasses caught the amber glow of overhead lights. The skyline of Manhattan stretched beyond the glass walls like a kingdom built for men like him. And around the table, executives in tailored suits exchanged subtle smirks, the kind reserved for moments when power feels unquestioned. Naomi Carter stood still beside the table, her tray balanced with practiced precision, her expression unreadable, the kind of calm that didn't ask for attention and never needed permission. She had heard that tone before, not once, not twice, but enough times to know it wasn't about her voice. It was about her place, or at least the place they thought she belonged in. Daniel leaned back slightly, adjusting his cufflinks with the ease of a man who had never doubted his control, a man whose decisions moved markets and whose silence could end careers. And tonight was no different. A $500 million acquisition hanging in the balance, a room full of people waiting for his final word. He didn't look at Naomi when he spoke, didn't need to, because in his world, people like her existed at the edges, unseen until needed, unheard unless summoned. "We're wasting time," he added, tapping the paper lightly, his tone edged with impatience. "This clause is airtight," and a few heads nodded quickly, not because they had checked, but because agreement was safer than question. Naomi moved to refill a glass, her steps quiet against the polished floor, her eyes scanning the table just once, not nervously, but carefully, as if she were reading something far more complex than the room allowed. There was a rhythm to moments like this, a familiar pattern where arrogance filled the space left by attention, where confidence replaced verification, and where the smallest detail, overlooked by everyone else, waited patiently to be noticed. One of the junior associates chuckled under his breath, whispering something about "just a waitress," and the words dissolved into the soft hum of background music, unnoticed by most, but not by her. Naomi paused for half a second, just enough for something to settle behind her eyes, then continued, placing the bottle down with quiet precision, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged, but something in the air had shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like the moment before a storm decides whether it will pass or stay. Daniel finally glanced up, not at her, but through her, as if confirming she was still where he expected her to be, still silent, still irrelevant. And in that single glance lived the certainty that had built his empire, the belief that he understood every piece on the board. What he didn't see, what no one at that table saw, was that the game had already changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, in the kind of way that doesn't announce itself until it's too late. Naomi took a breath, small, controlled, and for the first time that night, she spoke, not loudly, not forcefully, but clearly enough to cut through everything else. "You might want to read Clause 14 again." And just like that, the room stopped pretending it wasn't about to witness something it didn't expect. The words did not echo loudly, but they landed with precision, the kind that made people sit straighter without knowing why. And for a brief moment, no one moved, not the assistants, not the executives, not even Daniel Whitmore, whose fingers rested on the edge of the contract as if the paper itself had suddenly become heavier. He let out a quiet breath through his nose, the hint of a smile forming, not amused but dismissive, the kind of expression reserved for interruptions he did not consider worth his time. And yet something in the stillness of the room made him pause just long enough to glance down at the page again. "Clause 14? He repeated, almost casually, as if humoring a child, and a few soft chuckles followed, carefully measured, always aligning with his tone. Naomi did not step back, did not apologize, did not rush to fill the silence she had created. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, her gaze steady, not challenging, not submissive, just present in a way that refused to disappear. Daniel's eyes scanned the paragraph quickly at first, then slower, his brow tightening just slightly. A detail so small most would miss it, but not everyone in that room was as blind as they pretended to be. The junior associate who had laughed earlier shifted in his seat, his confidence shrinking as the seconds stretched longer than they should have. Daniel leaned forward now, the the chair beneath him barely making a sound, his focus narrowing as he read the clause again. This time not as a formality, but as a question. The numbers were there, the language was polished, the structure looked correct, but buried beneath the surface, hidden in a line designed to be overlooked, was a condition that shifted the entire balance of the deal. He read it once, then again. And the silence that followed was no longer comfortable. Someone cleared their throats softly, another adjusted their tie. But no one spoke, because the room had begun to understand what was happening without anyone saying it out loud. Daniel's jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second before he leaned back, masking the shift with practiced ease. But the illusion had already cracked. "Explain," he said finally, his voice controlled. But different now, less certain, more deliberate. Naomi tilted her head slightly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment. "The clause gives final authority to the silent partner if any compliance discrepancy is found," she said, her voice calm, measured, and impossibly clear. "And the discrepancy is already there, in the regional licensing section on page 12. And just like that, the room moved from doubt to realization. Daniel flipped the pages faster this time, no longer performing confidence, but searching for confirmation. And when he found it, when the line matched exactly what she had said, something shifted in his expression that no amount of control could fully hide. This was no longer about a waitress speaking out of turn. This was about a mistake. His mistake, sitting in plain sight. The executives exchanged glances now, subtle but sharp, recalculating everything they thought they understood about the situation. About him, about her. Naomi did not move, did not smile, did not claim the moment. She simply stood there as the weight of the truth settled over the table. And for the first time that night, Daniel Whitmore looked directly at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, as if trying to reconcile the person he thought he saw with the one now standing in front of him. And in that look was a question he was not used to asking, not about the deal, not about the numbers, but about her and who she really was. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected, stretching across the polished table like an invisible line no one dared to cross. And for the first time that evening, Daniel Whitmore did not rush to fill the silence. He studied her instead, not as background, not as service, but as a variable he had failed to calculate. Naomi Carter met his gaze without urgency, without defiance, just steady, as if she had already accepted whatever came next and did not need the room's permission to exist inside it. One of the senior partners leaned forward slightly, his voice careful now. "If what she is saying is correct, this entire structure shifts." And the word entire carried weight, the kind that could turn confidence into caution in less than a second. Daniel closed the contract slowly, his fingers pressing the edge of the paper flat against the table as if control could be restored through precision alone. But control was no longer his to assume, not completely. "How did you catch that?" he asked, the tone different now, not sharp, not dismissive, but edged with something unfamiliar, something closer to respect than he would have admitted. Naomi did not answer immediately, not because she did not have one, but because she chose the moment, and that choice alone shifted the balance again. "Because it was written to be missed," she said, her voice calm, her words landing clean. "And people who think they cannot be wrong usually stop looking too soon." And there it was, not an accusation, not a challenge, but a truth placed carefully on the table for everyone to see. A few eyes dropped, others lifted toward Daniel, measuring his reaction, waiting to see if the man who controlled everything would acknowledge the one thing he had not seen. Outside, the city lights flickered against the glass, reflections of power and ambition layered over each other. But inside, something quieter was unfolding, something more dangerous than any negotiation, the realization that the hierarchy in the room had shifted without anyone announcing it. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair, his posture still composed, but no longer effortless. And for a moment, he allowed himself to look at her fully, not as a role, not as a position, but as a person who had just altered the trajectory of a deal worth $500 million with a single sentence. "You read contracts in your spare time?" he asked, a faint edge of disbelief threading through his voice, as if trying to place her back into a category that made sense. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her eyes softened just enough to suggest she had heard that question before, just in different words. I read what people overlook, she replied, simple, direct, and impossible to dismiss. The room absorbed that quietly, the kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from understanding arriving all at once. Daniel tapped his fingers once against the table, a habit he had when recalculating, when shifting strategy, when realizing that the game he thought he was playing was not the only one in motion. And then he said it, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that carried further than anything else he had said that night. Stay. And it was not a command this time, not entirely. It was something closer to an invitation, or perhaps an acknowledgement that the person he had tried to dismiss was now the one he needed to understand. And Naomi Carter, who had been invisible just minutes ago, did not move, did not nod, did not thank him, because she had never been waiting to be asked. The words stayed in the air after he said it, not heavy, not forceful, but unfamiliar coming from him. And that was what made the room shift again, not because Daniel Whitmore had spoken, but because of how he had spoken, as if something in his certainty had quietly adjusted. Naomi Carter remained exactly where she was, neither stepping forward nor stepping back, her presence unchanged, as if the permission he had just offered was something she had never needed in the first place. One of the executives glanced at Daniel, then at her, then back at the contract, recalculating priorities in real time. Because in rooms like this, power was not declared, it was recognized, and recognition had just begun to move. Daniel opened the document again, slower this time, his attention sharper, the kind of focus he reserved for risk, not routine. And for the first time that evening, he did not skim, he read. Walk me through it, he said, his tone measured, no longer dismissive, but deliberate, and the difference did not go unnoticed. Naomi stepped closer to the table, not hesitantly, not cautiously, but with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly where she stood, her eyes moving to the page, her hand resting lightly on the edge as she pointed, precise, controlled. Here, she said. This language creates a conditional override. It looks like standard compliance wording, but it shifts authority if a discrepancy is triggered, and her voice carried without effort, clear enough to cut through the tension that had replaced the earlier arrogance. The senior partner leaned in further now, his earlier confidence replaced with attention, real attention, the kind that listens instead of waiting to speak. Daniel followed her finger across the lines, his jaw tightening, just slightly, as the structure revealed itself more fully, not flawed, but strategically dangerous, the kind of detail that could turn advantage into liability without warning. And you are certain this discrepancy exists? He asked, his voice steady, but no longer absolute. Naomi nodded once, small, precise. Page 12, Regional Licensing, subsection C. It conflicts with federal compliance language. That is enough to trigger the clause. And she did not rush the explanation, did not soften it, did not dress it in uncertainty. She simply laid it out, piece by piece, until the conclusion became unavoidable. The room fell into a different kind of silence now, not the earlier one shaped by ego, but one shaped by recognition, the understanding that something important had just been revealed, and not by the person anyone expected. Daniel closed the contract again, slower this time, his fingers resting on it as if weighing more than just paper, and when he looked up, the expression in his eyes had changed, not dramatically, not completely, but enough. And what happens if we sign this as is? He asked. Naomi met his gaze. Calm, unshaken. Then you give control to someone who is not sitting at this table. And that sentence landed with more force than anything said that night, because it stripped the room of its illusion of control in a single breath. A quiet murmur moved through the executives, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable, the sound of people realizing the ground beneath them had shifted. Daniel exhaled slowly, leaning back, his posture still composed, but no longer unquestioned, and for the first time, he allowed the silence to sit without trying to dominate it. Who wrote this? He asked, almost to himself, but not quite. Naomi's answer came without hesitation. Someone who knew exactly how you would read it. And in that moment, the power in the room did not disappear. It changed direction, moving away from assumption and towards something far more dangerous, awareness. The name lingered in Daniel's mind longer than it should have, not because he did not recognize strategy when he saw it, but because this time, the strategy had been designed for him, shaped around his habits, his assumptions, his certainty that he would never be the one caught off guard. He tapped the table once, a quiet, controlled motion, but the rhythm was different now, no longer signaling dominance, but calculation. "Give me the full compliance cross-check," he said without looking away. From Naomi, and immediately, two assistants moved, their fingers already racing across tablets, the urgency no longer hidden beneath politeness. The room shifted again, chairs adjusting, eyes sharper, voices gone, because this was no longer a routine negotiation. This was exposure, and exposure had a way of making even the most confident people reconsider what they thought they knew. Naomi stepped back slightly, not retreating, just allowing space for the process to unfold, her hands resting calmly at her sides, her posture unchanged, as if she had already finished what she came to do. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, studying the absence of performance, the lack of urgency, the quiet certainty that did not seek validation, and it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain. One of the assistants spoke first, her voice careful but clear. "There is a discrepancy," she said, and that was all it took, not a full explanation, not a dramatic reveal, just confirmation. Simple and undeniable. A ripple moved through the room, subtle but sharp, the kind of reaction that does not need volume to carry impact. Daniel nodded once, slow, controlled, absorbing it, recalibrating in real time, because men like him did not collapse under pressure. They adapted, they shifted, they rebuilt the narrative before anyone else could define it for them. But this time, the narrative had already moved beyond his control. "Who is the silent partner?" he asked, his voice steady, but no longer casual. Another pause, longer this time, because the answer mattered more than anything that had been said so far. One of the executives glanced at the screen, then back at Daniel, hesitation flickering for just a second before he spoke. "It is listed under a private holding structure," and that hesitation was enough to say everything. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in focus, the kind that searched for patterns, for leverage, for the missing piece that would restore the balance he was used to holding. And then, almost instinctively, his gaze returned to Naomi, not because he had proof, not yet, but because something in the timing, in the precision, in the quiet way she had stepped into the moment and reshaped it, refused to be ignored. "You knew this before you walked in here," he said, not as an accusation, but as a realization forming out loud. Naomi did not answer immediately, not out of hesitation, but because silence, when used correctly, could say more than explanation. The city lights flickered. Behind her, reflections dancing across the glass, but she remained still, grounded, as if the entire room had shifted around her while she stayed exactly where she had always been. "I knew enough," she said finally, her voice even, her words measured, "to see how you would handle it." And that was when the last layer of certainty in the room began to unravel, because this was no longer just about a contract, or a mistake, or a deal. This was about observation, intention, and something far more deliberate than anyone at that table had prepared for. The room did not react all at once. It shifted in layers, like a structure realizing too late that its foundation had been quietly moved, and Daniel Whitmore felt it before anyone else spoke. The subtle change in posture, in breathing, in the way attention no longer centered solely on him. He leaned forward again, slower this time, his fingers interlocked on the table, not as a gesture of control, but of focus, as if narrowing the world down to one variable he had not yet solved. "You were watching," he said, his voice lower now, less performative, more precise. And it was not a question, it was a conclusion. Naomi Carter held his gaze, steady, unhurried, the kind of stillness that did not come from hesitation, but from certainty, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the silence itself had become part of the conversation. Around them, the executives remained quiet, but no longer out of deference. Now it was anticipation, the sense that something larger than a deal was unfolding, something that would redefine how this moment would be remembered. Daniel exhaled slowly, his mind moving through possibilities. through scenarios, through every angle he could have missed. And that was the part that unsettled him most. Not the mistake, but the realization that someone else had seen it coming while he had not. Why? He asked finally. One word. Simple, direct, but carrying more weight than any negotiation point that had come before it. Naomi's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted, not softer, not harder, just clearer, as if the question had unlocked something she had been holding back. Because this was never just about the deal, she said, her voice calm, measured, each word placed exactly where it needed to be. It was about how you handle people you think do not matter. And the sentence landed with a quiet force that no one in the room could ignore. A subtle movement passed through the table, a glance here, a shift there, the kind of reaction that does not announce itself but changes everything. Daniel sat back slightly, absorbing it, not defensively, not dismissively, but with a level of attention he rarely gave to anything outside of numbers and outcomes. And for the first time that night, he did not respond immediately, because there was nothing easy to say. The skyline beyond the glass seemed distant now, less like a symbol of control and more like a reminder of how quickly perception could change, how fragile certainty could become when challenged by something real. One of the executives cleared his throat quietly, as if to break the tension, but no one followed. Because this was no longer a discussion they could interrupt, Daniel's eyes remained on Naomi, studying her, in a way that was no longer about position or status, but about understanding, about recalibrating something deeper than strategy. And what did you see? He asked, his voice steady, but no longer absolute. Naomi paused for just a fraction of a second, not searching for words, but choosing them. And when she spoke, the room seemed to hold its breath without realizing it. I saw someone who never expected to be questioned, she said, calm, direct, and unshaken. And someone who stopped looking the moment he thought he had already won. And that was when the final layer of the room's illusion began to fall away, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, leaving behind something far more uncomfortable than failure, awareness. The words did not spark outrage. They did something far more dangerous. They settled, quietly, deeply, into the space Daniel Whitmore had always controlled, and for the first time in a long time, he did not immediately push back. He sat there, still, his gaze fixed on Naomi Carter, not with disbelief, not with irritation, but with something slower, heavier, the kind of realization that does not arrive all at once but builds, piece by piece, until it can no longer be ignored. Around the table, no one dared to interrupt, because what was unfolding was no longer about a contract or a deal. It was about a shift, subtle but undeniable, the kind that changes how every person in the room understands their place. Daniel's fingers relaxed slightly against the table, the tension no longer hidden behind movement. And when he finally spoke, his voice was different, not weaker, but stripped of the effortless certainty that had defined him just minutes ago. You are not here by accident, he said, more to himself than to her. But the words carried, because they were not a question, they were a conclusion forming in real time. Naomi did not respond right away, not because she needed time, but because she understood the weight of silence, how it allowed truth to settle without resistance, how it forced people to confront what they had just realized instead of escaping it. One of the executives shifted in his seat, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to caution, because if she was not who they thought she was, then everything about this meeting had been misread from the beginning. Daniel leaned forward again, slower this time, his attention no longer divided, his focus narrowed entirely on her, as if the rest of the room had faded into the background. So tell me, he said, his tone controlled but no longer dismissive. Who are you really? And that question landed differently than anything else he had said, not because of the words, but because of what it admitted that he did not know, that he had never known, that he had made assumptions he could no longer defend. Naomi took a small step forward, not to close distance, but to meet the moment, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, and when she spoke, it was not louder, not sharper, just clearer, the kind of clarity that leaves no space for misunderstanding. Someone you did not think was worth noticing, she said, and the simplicity of it made it harder to dismiss than any elaborate explanation ever could. The room absorbed that quietly, the The kind of silence that follows when something obvious is finally said out loud. When the truth that has been sitting in plain sight is acknowledged without decoration. Daniel's jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in recognition, because he could see it now, not just the mistake in the contract, but the mistake in his perception, the pattern he had followed without question, the way he had categorized people before understanding them. Outside, the city continued as if nothing had changed, lights moving, traffic flowing, a world built on momentum. But inside that room, everything had slowed, narrowed, focused on a single realization that no one could ignore anymore. Daniel exhaled slowly, his posture still composed, but no longer untouchable, and for the first time that night, he did not try to reclaim the moment. He did not redirect, did not dominate. He simply looked at her and said, quieter now, but more honest than anything before, I misjudged you. And it was not an apology, not yet, but it was something rarer for a man like him, acknowledgement, and in that acknowledgement, the balance of power completed its shift, not with noise, not with spectacle, but with truth. The words settled between them, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that shifted everything. And for a moment, no one moved, because acknowledgement from a man like Daniel Whitmore did not happen often, and when it did, it carried more weight than any apology ever could. Naomi Carter held his gaze, steady, unshaken, not absorbing the moment, not reacting to it, simply allowing it to exist without claiming it. And that restraint, that quiet refusal to turn recognition into triumph, changed the atmosphere more than anything else could have. One of the executives leaned back slowly, his earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, more careful, because the hierarchy he had relied on had just been rewritten without warning. Daniel glanced down at the contract again, then back at her, as if connecting pieces that had been scattered in plain sight. And when he spoke, his voice was no longer shaped by assumption, but by intent. You knew exactly where to look, he said, not as praise, but as fact, and the difference mattered. Naomi nodded once, small, precise. I knew where people usually stop looking, she replied, and that answer did not elevate her. It revealed the gap that had always been there. A faint shift passed through the room, the kind that does not make noise but changes perspective. The realization that what had just happened was not luck, not coincidence, but design, awareness applied at the exact moment it was needed. Daniel's fingers tapped once against the table, then stilled, a habit interrupted, a rhythm broken, and for the first time, he did not try to regain it. The deal needs to be restructured, he said, turning slightly toward his team, his tone firm again, but different, no longer rooted in certainty, but in correction, and immediately, the assistants moved, the quiet urgency returning, but this time, it followed her insight, not his assumption. Naomi stepped back just enough to remove herself from the center, not because she was dismissed, but because she had already shifted what needed to be shifted. The city lights behind her reflected softly against the glass, a reminder of everything that continued outside this room. Unchanged, unaware, but inside, something had recalibrated permanently. Daniel watched her for a moment longer, not trying to define her, not trying to place her back into something familiar, because he understood now that the categories he relied on had failed him. You said this was about how I handle people, he said, his voice quieter now, more measured, as if the question mattered beyond the moment. So tell me, what would you have done differently? And the room stilled again, not because they expected an answer, but because they understood that whatever came next would not be about the deal anymore. Naomi paused, not for effect, not for control, but because the truth she was about to speak did not need to be rushed, and when she finally answered, her voice remained calm, steady, untouched by the shift she had created. I would have looked closer, she said, simple, direct, and impossible to argue with. And I would have listened before deciding who mattered. And that was when the silence returned, not empty, not tense, but full, carrying something the room had not felt before, not power, not pressure, but clarity, the kind that does not fade once it arrives. The silence did not break. It evolved, settling into something steadier, something that no longer needed tension to exist, and Daniel Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, his eyes on Naomi Carter, not searching now, not questioning, but understanding in a way that did not come easily to him. He nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if confirming something to himself rather than to anyone else in the room. And when he spoke again, his voice carried none of the sharpness from earlier, only clarity. "Then we fix it," he said, turning the contract toward his team, but the weight of his words extended beyond the pages in front of him, because this was no longer just about correcting a clause. It was about correcting a pattern. The executives moved quickly, quieter now, more precise, their earlier confidence replaced with focus, because the room had learned something it could not unlearn. Naomi stepped back fully this time, returning to the edge of the table, her role visually unchanged, but nothing about her presence felt the same, not to them, not to him. Daniel watched her for a second longer before shifting his attention to the window, the city stretching endlessly beyond the glass, lights flickering like decisions being made in rooms just like this one. But for the first time that night, he did not see it as something he controlled. He saw it as something he was still learning to understand. "You said you read what people overlook," he said, his voice quieter. Now, almost reflective, and though he did not turn back immediately, the question was meant for her. "So what did I miss besides the contract?" And the room stilled again, not out of tension, but out of anticipation, because this question was different. It was not about business. It was about something deeper. Naomi did not hesitate, did not shift, did not soften her answer. She simply spoke, steady as before. "You missed the fact that the most important person in the room is not always the one speaking the loudest." And the words settled slowly, not as a challenge, but as a truth that no one could dismiss. Daniel exhaled quietly, a small release of something unspoken, and for a moment, he allowed that truth to sit without trying to reshape it, without trying to own it, and that alone marked the final shift. He turned back to her, not as someone reclaiming authority, but as someone acknowledging change, and this time, when he met her eyes, there was no distance left, no assumption, no dismissal, only recognition. "Thank you," he said, simple, direct, and unguarded. And it was not about the deal, not entirely. It was about the moment, about what had been revealed, about what had been corrected. Naomi gave a small nod, not accepting praise, not rejecting it, just acknowledging that the moment had reached its natural end. And without another word, she turned, lifting her tray with the same quiet precision she had walked in with, her steps steady as she moved away from the table. No one stopped her, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to add. The lesson had already been delivered, not loudly, not forcefully, but in a way that would remain long after the meeting ended. And as the door closed softly behind her, the room did not return to what it had been, because some shifts do not reverse, some realizations do not fade, and somewhere between the first dismissal and the final word, everything that mattered had already changed.